Okay, Colin. Aloha. My name is Roger Jelinek. I'm Executive Director of the Hawaii Book and Music Festival. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to what should be a really fascinating discussion. This is an unusual form for the festival because we've been virtual for the past 3 years, thanks to COVID. We plan to be in full festival next year, about this time next year. But I very much wanted to honor Hawaii authors, and they come. We have quite a range, a geographical range. It's morning in Paris, where Makana is speaking from. We've just had a session with speakers from New York and California, and it's so far it's the last session was really very distinguished and quite marvelous. I'm quite sure the same is going to be true of this one. Your moderator is Peter Shaindlin, who, as I say, is kind of indefinable because he's so good at so many different things. He's a terrific photographer, a poet, a novelist, and he happens to be the CEO of the Halekulani Hotel, one of our sponsors. So it's my great pleasure to hand this over to you, Peter.
Roger, thank you so much. Welcome everybody worldwide, including Makana Eyre from Paris. I'm here looking at a malasada, and you're probably got a croissant in front of you, so maybe you win. Thanks, Roger, again. Thanks everybody for joining this special event tonight. It's my honor to be your moderator for the next hour and to be with all of you. And Makana, it's an honor to have you with us. So near but so far, and we really appreciate your time. I've been reading your book, and when I completed it, I put it down, and it was so many things to me. It's riveting, it's shocking, it's disturbing, it's overwhelming, it's tragic, but at the same time, it's incredibly compelling and in many ways inspiring and even reassuring in certain ways. Before I go further, I just want to acknowledge to everybody that, as Roger indicated, Makana is from Hawaii, from Oahu, in the United States, where I am and many of us are tonight here. Welcome again, Makana. Your remarkable book, this nonfiction work we're discussing tonight, is Sing Memory. You can see it over my shoulder, the cover there. It's published by W.W. Norton and Company in New York. And if I can just ask you, Makana, just before we get into the book itself, maybe you can take a moment to talk about the diversity of work that you're doing in Europe, that you've been doing in the last few years there, if you don't mind, off the cuff.
Sure. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning from me in Paris. My name is Makana Eyre, and as Peter said, I'm a journalist based in Paris, but I'm from Hawaii originally. I write about mostly politics and culture in books from Paris for publications like the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and The Nation. I'm the author of Sing Memory, which came out this past May. And I'm very happy to be here to speak about this book a bit more and to share what it contains.
Thanks so much. The book, back to the book. If you could take a few minutes to set for everyone here the story, assuming that a number of people here, I'm sure perhaps the majority have not had the opportunity yet to read the book, but are obviously curious to learn more from you tonight. If you could talk about the setting, perhaps the main characters, overarching themes, which I know is complex, but you can set a starting point for us, perhaps, and I'll leave you there to kick in.
Thank you. Well, Sing Memory follows the story of two prisoners of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp during the Second World War. And these two prisoners were Alexander Kulishevich and Rosemary Darguto, who, though vastly different in background, formed a very close relationship while prisoners at Sachsenhausen, and their friendship was based on a shared love of music. Darguto, Kulishevich discovered, had founded and was leading a clandestine Jewish choir at Sachsenhausen, a choir made up of about 25 Jewish prisoners who would gather and rehearse and eventually perform in the barracks. And over several months, the two men grew extremely close, Darguto acting as a mentor figure to a young Kulishevich, and both involved themselves deeply in the musical life of Sachsenhausen, which was surprisingly rich. Darguto acted as the conductor, as the arranger of his choir, of his secret choir, and Kulishevich became a prolific camp composer. He spent several years composing music that recounted his life in the camp, and he would get up in front of his barracks mates in the barracks and perform this music in often semi-secret evening gatherings of music after the work was completed for the day. The pivotal event takes place in the fall of 1942, when Darguto sensed that his death was approaching, and he gave Kulishevich a mission, and this mission was to save the music of Sachsenhausen. Darguto believed that the music that was being created at Sachsenhausen amounted to a crucial body of historical witnessing that had to be saved. And because there was no possibility to write things down, because paper and pencil were forbidden at the camp, the only way to do this was to memorize. And after Darguto was deported to Auschwitz, along with his entire choir in the fall of 42, Kulishevich spent the remainder of his time in the camp memorizing as much music as he could. He would ask people in the camp to share with him, to dictate to him the music that they had composed, the lyrics that they had composed, and he would memorize it. And after surviving the camp and after surviving the death march, he dictated from a hospital bed in Krakow in 1945 over 700 pages of music, of verses, of poetry that he had memorized, from some of which he had composed himself, and a lot of which had been created by people that he met while at Sachsenhausen. And he spent the remainder of his life building an archive that would contain the music and the poetry and the art of all the camps across Europe, from camps like Buchenwald and Auschwitz and Dachau. And so this mission that he received from Darguto in 1942 went on to change his life forever. And he spent the remaining 40 years in communist Poland building what became what I would say the most important archive dedicated to music in the Nazi camps that we have anywhere in the world.
Makana, thank you. If I recall correctly, that when he was in that hospital bed, that there was a nurse, one of the nurses tending to him, who, by whatever circumstance, connected with him and seemed to understand this in a fundamental way. And then she proceeded to show up with a typewriter and type as he spoke these 700 pages. And that at that point, you wrote that he experienced an extraordinary elation, that there was some initial memorialization, at least, of the work. But that ended up being very early on for the recounting over the years.
He thought he was going to die. He was extremely sick, and he was in this hospital with an intense fever, and he wasn't sure he would survive. And so he began to mutter these poems, these lyrics, and he was initially considered insane. The doctors who were tending to him thought he was delirious with fever or had gone insane as a survivor of a Nazi camp. But it was this nurse who found some sense in what he was saying and realized that he was actually dictating. And she brought this dinky typewriter to his bedside and spent several weeks writing down what he was saying. And what she had at the end of these 2 weeks was over 700 pages of mainly of lyrics, you could say, because she wasn't writing down notes, but she was copying down all of the things that he had memorized over 5 years of imprisonment in Sachsenhausen.
So you had two equal opposites taking place there at the same time. It's just to digress for a moment. You have the case of him with an eidetic memory. So he's able to have memorized hundreds of works, and hundreds of pieces of music, perhaps. And then from that complete cognitive, self-driven recall, he expresses it to somebody who then takes it down in the most mechanical fashion, but the most, other than a tape recording, was the most advanced way that could be done at that time, which was nowhere near the facility that he had,
Yes.
organically, right? It's interesting.
Yes.
If I can also digress just a little bit of in medias res for you right now, if I can drop back in the story for a minute and ask you, for everyone here, how did you stumble into this? Or did you stumble into it, or is it different than that?
It was stumbling for sure. I wish I had a more satisfying explanation of this, but I write a lot about Central Europe, Poland in particular, and I was writing quite a bit in 2018, 2019 about this region, a region that was under the grip of a far-right government, which may just have lost in the last election. We're waiting to see what will happen in the end. But I was looking for long features to write, and I came across this story, I believe, thanks to a local publication in Poland that had mentioned in passing a story about a certain survivor of Sachsenhausen who had memorized tons and tons of music. And the story was initially interesting to me, but I didn't know what I had come across for several months. And it was only when I started to read these accounts of musical life in the Nazi camps did I understand this was something special and worth looking into further.
I think that you early in the book, when you set this early setting before he's arrested and brought away by train and imprisoned, incarcerated, I felt that in a constructive, it was important to you to establish for the reader that here he was in Poland, which has an extraordinarily complex political history over the last 3 centuries or so. And you and I talked recently. You had mentioned briefly the partitions in late 18th century, the 1780s or 90s, I think, in Poland, where you had this triumvirate. You had the Axis with the I think it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russia, and was it Prussia? I'm not sure.
Prussia or kind of early Germany, but Prussia, Austria, and Russia indeed.
Right. Okay. And so from there was this disconnect. I think it was almost 150 years after that, at least, before there was any other reformation in terms of sovereign structure to the country. And then, so it wasn't much after that Poland found itself right into the 1920s and 30s, after the First World War, and just before the Second, where they were used to having this threat, and particularly from Germany, there was tremendous amount of concern well before. So this idea that most of us have in our head that, the war started in Europe because Hitler attacked Poland suddenly, it was no surprise to most Poles. Would that be correct? What he saw happen?
I mean, I've traveled to Poland extensively in the last 10 years. And at the beginning of my travels, I always found it surprising how much lingering resentment there is toward Russia and Germany. And at first I was surprised, but when you learn about the history of this country, you understand that that's absolutely warranted, I think. Poland, if you go back, starting at the first partition until the Second World War, and then straight into communism, and then up to the 90s, Poland was independent for about 20 years in that time, in those centuries. It has existed between hungry and ambitious empires for centuries, Russia to the east, Germany, Austria to the west, and for various complicated geopolitical reasons, they have been under the subjugation of these countries for a very, very long time. So to me, the 1920s in Poland was a pivotal point for my book, because it was the time when Kuliszewicz was raised, and it was this time of extraordinary rebirth of Polish culture, of Poland as a country. I mean, it was literally not on the map before the First World War. And so it was in this environment that Kuliszewicz grew up, in this environment of immense hope, but a hope that was very quickly extinguished when the Nazis came to power and when the Germans eventually invaded and took over Poland. So that to me was an important setting to include, because it really influenced Kulichevich as a person, and it influenced his entire life and how he viewed the politics and history in his country.
At that very early age, right before he was captured and taken in, he became, he was an activist, right? He was an activist. And so who was more of the activist, him or Darguto, who they hadn't met yet, where they hadn't met yet?
I think Kulichevich was active politically insofar as he was writing for the press after the invasion took place and writing articles that were against Hitler, against the Germans. And it was for this reason that he was eventually arrested and deported. I think chiefly his chief concern was really to be musical, to perform with his guitar in front of cabaret audiences, to travel around the region, listening to music, experiencing music. He was a law student, but a very, very reluctant one. All he really wanted to do was to be involved in music. Darguto, on the other hand, was far more active. And I should note, though, that he was 30 years older than Kulichevich. So he was being raised in Poland as well, but in a very different version of Poland, the Poland of the 1890s, under Russian control, under the brutal control of Russia, we can say. And he was a leftist. Like many young Polish Jews of the 1890s, he was drawn very, very strongly toward socialism, toward communism, and toward a new version of how society could look. And it was he who was really the activist, first in Poland, from which he eventually had to flee when he was a teenager for participating in several anti-Russian and pro-socialist causes around the 1905 revolution, and then in Berlin as a radical leftist composer and musician and writer too, who was often found in the pages of the Red Flag, the communist organ newspaper of Berlin, and among people like Rosa Luxemburg and other prominent leftist radicals of the time. So it was more Darguto, I would say, who was the radical. He, as he grew older, as sometimes happens, he moved away from politics somewhat and focused fully on his music, but he was the one with the real radical roots of the two.
But now here you have far away, again, they haven't met, one's 30 years older than the other, and fate has them converge at Sachsenhausen at this camp eventually. But we have, before they ever met, am I correct? I mean, in fundamental terms, you have two activists, right? Mm-hmm. Different generations in the mm-hmm. same country. And then they're both musicians, and they're both aspirational musicians, although Darguto was much further along, given age and timing. Career-wise, he was active with, I think it was the New Cologne Choir that he took over in Berlin. And by the way, it just struck me that this morning that November 25th, according to the date in the book you have in the book, will be the 100th anniversary of him debuting as conductor with the choir.
That's a great
going
point.
Back through my notes, and I said, "Oh, that's in 4 weeks. Yes. We have to do something, right? Someone Indeed. Should perform something." But at any rate, it's fascinating that you have these two people who they're a lot different, but they have a lot in common, right? Yeah. And then they converge under the most abominable circumstances that not only anyone, but also two artists or two musicians can ever imagine meeting under. If you talk about not only the overall negativity of the experience. And on that note, I wanted to just shift gears a little bit and say that this morning, I was looking back through the book, and my early notes as I'm getting into that early part, you start to first read of the horrors that's taking place in this camp, and then others. I said to myself, philosophically, what philosopher is the most obvious person whose thought is the most antithetical to these? Well, there are a lot, because you go back centuries to early religious philosophy and so on and so forth. And even the Gospels, right? But it for me was John Stuart Mill's, because I thought his whole fundamental thing was do no harm to others, and so I thought, well, this is the most antithetical place in the world to everything he everything he built on for his philosophy. And the reason I bring that up is even though they found they had to resist all this to survive, you had explained to me a couple of weeks ago that that it wasn't just creating art, even though they were trapped in this horrible environment and right on the edge of death any given day, and seeing it firsthand every day. But that you said that it also became a way of survival for each of them, and hopefully for some of the people that they were directing or conducting or transcribing for, correct? And that you said it also, could you talk about the fact that you said, unfortunately, but the reality was it also gave them a kind of prestige that might have improved their chances of survival. Was that, do I have that right?
That's all correct. Music was a complicated, but I would say essential part of life in Sachsenhausen and in the camps across the Nazi system. Let's see, indeed, the prisoners like Klushevich and scores or hundreds of others were using music as a means to process their emotions, to process trauma, to document their lives, to long for favorite foods, for spouses, for lovers, to remind themselves of home. They were using music in this way that when they felt an acute emotion, and primarily those emotions were fear and distress, but also at certain times, small moments of hope or even joy, they would use music as a means to express those emotions effectively. And here I should make a note, which is when I speak of composition, what I'm primarily talking about is what a musicologist might call parody songs. And a parody song is when an existing song is taken and the melody remains intact, but a person gives the melody new lyrics. And a lot of what was being done at Sachsenhausen was this kind of parody music. There was, of course, music created that was fully original, the melody and the lyrics, and there was music of all sorts that was being created in all the camps, some which I would say has genuine artistic value, but a lot of it was this musical parody, you could say, and so what you see in the lyrics is these emotions, and prisoners would take songs that they knew from before the war, music from films, popular music, scout songs, even patriotic songs at times, and overlay them with new lyrics. And so what you have is really a body of historical witnessing, you could say. A lot of what we know from the Nazi camps comes from memoirs, testimony, interviews that took place after the war. And though those sources of information are crucial, of course, they come with the caveat that memory changes, memory fades, and narratives can influence how a person recalls their experiences. What we have here instead is a body of witnessing that is being done sometimes in the very moment a person is feeling or experiencing something. You have cases where a prisoner is experiencing an execution or a flogging, and in that moment he is composing lyrics to put onto a song, onto a melody. So what you have there is witnessing in real time, and as you say, indeed, if you were a performer and a composer, and people found value in that work that you were doing, if you were going around from barracks to barracks when it was safe to share the music that you were composing, that you were creating, that did sometimes push you up on the hierarchy of Sachsenhausen. Sachsenhausen, like all the Nazi camps, had a very strict hierarchy, and it depended on what your nationality was, what your religion was, what your status was, put you somewhere on this hierarchy, and the higher you were on the hierarchy, the better your experience was, the more food you had. It was horrible for everyone, of course. We can be clear there. But if you were, for example, a Norwegian political prisoner at Sachsenhausen, you were in a much better position than if you were a Jewish prisoner or a homosexual prisoner or a Russian POW. So music was a sort of it could be a means to raise your stature. We see this with Kulishevich quite a bit. He was transferred to a barracks in 1940 that was filled with some of the most prominent German prisoners, and that indicates to me and to scholars that it was really his music was the thing that put him there, and it raised his stature.
And who was responding positively in terms of the supervisors of these facilities? In other words, it was impressing someone, it was affecting someone, and it slowed them down in some way from simply throwing them to the chambers in many situations, right? Who were those? Were they the guards? Was it the upper, you mentioned that caste system of prisoners, so to speak, informally. Who was at times responsive to that?
Well, the camps across the entire system were under what was euphemistically called self-administration. And what that meant was that prisoners themselves were administering themselves. So you had a system of prisoners who were running the functioning of the camp. You had the ratio of SS guards to prisoners was a lot. There were far fewer SS guards to prisoners than you might expect, especially at Sachsenhausen. So you had prisoner functionaries with lots of power, particularly the German prisoners were in positions of power, and they had the ability to assign people to barracks. They had the ability to punish people or to let them go. They had the ability to effectively save lives at times, even give more food or less food. And so it was these prisoner functionaries who really were increasingly impressed by the work of Kulishevich and other camp troubadours. And it was they who enabled these prisoners to rise on the hierarchy.
So let's dive right into this for a moment. And I like to kind of approach this from a point of two extremes. You mentioned the parody lyricism, which also the dark humor in that. There was a real gallows humor, and no pun intended whatsoever, but it literally was gallows humor at the core and in many cases. And if I'm correct, for example, one of the famous ones was the Jewish Death Song, which was, I think it was composition by Darguto, but you wrote that it was based on a Yiddish folk song that so many people, probably most of the people there, would know right away. And he embellished it with a somber, almost funeral march entrance with these bum, 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 this dirge that starts at the beginning, right? And people, by the way, for the audience here, you can find various interpretations of this chorally and otherwise on YouTube and all sorts of other sources, right? That's a very famous piece of music. But that was based on this Yiddish song about 10 brothers, I believe, and it starts to the effect, everyone, that a person in the first person is saying, "This happened to me, this happened to me," and they're taking me to the gas chamber now. And that's my close recollection on my part informally, but that and then there were 9. It sort of takes that route, right? And you can't stop listening because each one is more horrible than the last, or at least as horrible. On the flip side, there was the harsh reality where it wasn't parody lyricism, but someone looked death in the face literally and memorialized it. And you and I were talking earlier about one of the prisoners, I think was Aaron, Aron, who's I think was a 3-year-old son was murdered in front of him. Do you have that passage anywhere handy that we can?
I can introduce it briefly first. So Aaron Liebeskind was his name. Was a Jewish prisoner at Sachsenhausen who had been transferred to Sachsenhausen according to what he told Kulishevich. And according to what he told Kulishevich, he had in Poland had witnessed the murders of his wife and his young son. And after witnessing these murders, which he was saved from because of his perceived strength, the SS thought he was strong and therefore wanted to send him to a work detail. He begged the foreman of the crematorium to spend time with the corpse of his son, and while he was with the corpse of his son, he composed a song that he dictated to Kulishevich in 1942 in Sachsenhausen. And the song was one of the most difficult ones, I would say, of the entire repertoire. And it's a rather searing few lines. So I'll read the first verse of the song. Crematorium, black and silent, gates of hell, corpses piled high. I drag stiff, slippery corpses while the sun smiles in the sky. Here he lies, my only little boy, tiny fists pressed in his mouth. How can I cast you into the flames with your shining golden hair?
That's not easy to read or even to hear. And that the way, for me also, from an almost poetic standpoint, he juxtaposes, you feel his anger through this personification of the sun that seems irreverent. Nature, the natural world's irreverent. And here's this horrible tragedy, and none of it's going to help him. And the fact that a parent could do that, it's incomprehensible. So there's the harsh reality, but the parodies are, you feel the equal anger as one of many aspects of the lyricism in the parody lyricism, right, as well, as you indicated before. Times we're already at our halfway point, but I wanted to move along and without necessarily talking about what happens to our lead character by the end of this book. Can you take us a little bit on with us? Can you take us with him on his journey after the war in simple terms, so people can get a little bit of a feeling that the book continues beyond this into the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond, which I didn't expect at all.
Yeah, well, the post-war years are really important, and a lot more important than you might expect. In 1945, after surviving this extreme fever and dictating the music, Kulishevich tried to move on. He tried to do to restart his life. He tried to forget the camp and forget the past, and he, for about 5 years, put on a fairly good imitation of normal life. He re-enrolled in law school. He worked as a journalist, first in Krakow and then in Prague. But the music of the camp and the camp experiences very quickly began to creep back into his mind and affect him in a way that was so intense that he could not maintain this imitation of normal life. I think that above all, this promise that he made to Draguto to save the music of Sachsenhausen, he began to interpret this promise as being far broader. He began to interpret it as the need to save the music of the entire camp system for the same reason as the music of Sachsenhausen, because it was this extremely valuable resource for scholars, for the public, that was being very quickly forgotten and very quickly destroyed, because no one was documenting this music at all. I mean, it was considered by expert musicians as vulgar, as having no value at all, because it was made by mostly amateurs in circumstances that were extremely serious and extremely violent. And so at the cost of his study life, at the cost of his young family, which he had by then, he began to devote himself almost exclusively to building an archive that would contain all the music and all the poetry and all the theater from 35 major Nazi camps. And so what he did was travel around Poland and interview former prisoners, interview survivors, and ask them to dictate to him once again the music that they had heard or the music that they had composed themselves. And he began little by little to amass this archive of information with all this music. At the same time, he also found it important to share the music, and so he kind of retook his role as a camp performer, as a camp singer, and starting in the mid-1960s, would travel around Europe to perform his repertoire and the music of other prisoners in front of audiences. And this performing grew very quickly, and for about 15 or 20 years, he was performing in front of fairly large audiences, especially in Germany at the big folk festivals, where prominent leftist singers were performing. And he ended up performing, I think, in over 90 venues across Europe and even in the US, sharing this music for the purpose of memorialization and to keep it alive. So his kind of post-war life was circled around these two prongs, collecting these documents, collecting these songs, making this massive archive, and performing the songs as widely as possible. And I can actually tell you, by the end of his life, his archive was just enormous. And I can tell you, just because it speaks to his work, I can tell you about what the archive contained. The archive is now held at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And when it arrived in the early 90s, it contained about 70,000 pages of documentation about music in the Nazi camps, 70,000. About 850 songs from 34 camps written by himself and by other prisoners, thousands of microfilmed and original notebooks, diaries, prints, sketches, photographs, maps, letters, postcards, memoirs, all kinds of documents, and tens of thousands of open reel tape and cassette tape, which contained recordings he had made across Europe and recordings of his own life and interviews with people he had met during his research. So what he created was unique in size and scope and enormous. If you ever go to the archives in Washington, you'll see just the size of this archive. It reminds me a little bit of the last scene of Indiana Jones, where they have the crates that go forever into this warehouse. It's sort of like this. It's just boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes. And he was a singular person in his archiving activities, and we really have him to thank for a lot of the information we have about this topic.
In reading his later years, it seemed to me that the traumatic damage that was caused to his psyche that negatively affected his relationships with women, with marriages, with his children, was irreparable, and on top of everything else, added to his despair. But in the end, with what you just described, one could argue that in the end he succeeded, and it lives forever. I think, right? If you not only poured through these materials from Berlin to Sachsenhausen to Washington, D.C., to all over the world for years. You worked on this for 4 or 5 years, I believe, from inception to publication. But you also, later on, you actually connected to his immediate family. Can you talk about that for a moment and what you got from that, what you drew from that?
Yeah, I was lucky. Kuliszewicz had 3 sons, and all 3 of his sons are alive today. 2 live in Krakow still, and 1 lives in Chicago. And I spent uncountable hours with these 3 sons discussing the life of their father, and they really gave me deep entry into the life of their father, and in a way their own lives too, because they were the ones who experienced a parent who was solely focused on this mission, who was living in the trauma of the Nazi camps and wasn't always a present or active father, you could say. The other descendant I really learned a lot from was I was very lucky to be doing this research when because Darguto, my second character, his nephew, a man called Justus Rosenberg, was alive at the time, and I discovered him in January or February of 2020 when he was 99 years old. And given his advanced age, I got on a plane about a week later and flew to New York and spent 2 days interviewing him he is the only, or he's passed on now. He was the only person alive at the time who knew Darguto personally, who had known him as an uncle, and who had spent time both with him in Berlin and with him in Poland in the interwar years. And he opened up a whole new, he opened up a world of information for me that was not in the scholarly records. And I'm so glad I went there when I did, because this was about 3 or 4 weeks before COVID began. And I just caught him in time, because the whole world, as we all know, closed down. And he died before I would have been able to go back. So these descendants were really important for the research. And I think the book would be a lot less rich if I had not had the chance to speak with them.
You are in the last few years, as you just mentioned, in the case of Justus Rosenberg and others, you are witnessing a number of these people, many of whom you spent direct time with and developed relationships with, right? One-on-one. You're watching them fade away now, right? In these years, where, as you said, he was 99, and many of them at that age, or many you missed. That speaks as a testament, I think, even further to my earlier point, where you look at the archives. You mentioned this incredible voluminous storage of these works, and that incredible museum in DC. And there's so much to be culled from that. And I think that before before we head on our home stretch, it's almost a quarter of the hour already, and I want to leave a few minutes for questions if people should have them. Back to the music for a moment. I have to say this. I wanted to say, actually, Makana, not only to you, but to everyone attending, that particularly if there are musicians in the house, and we have many dozens of people attending from around the world tonight, it's a great turnout tonight, or whether you are or not, if you can read music, actually in the book, there's several images of transcriptions it's very easy to read for anybody with basic musical skills. And if you play an instrument, as I and many others do, play it. And if you don't, sing it. And it's absolutely extraordinary that you feel that once you've read the book in particular, that it sucks you in like a vacuum right back into the text, but really actually in a sort of eidetic spirit, that you don't need to go back to the book to reference it at that point, because a lot of the dots of the story that Makana's told really start to come together through the music. And when the lyrics, you've read the lyrics in the course of reading, a lot of the lyrics in the course of reading the book, but then the music comes back, and you have this coalescing of these collective elements of expression. And I think that he and Darguto, it's quite clear to me from an aesthetic standpoint, all other things aside, that it still didn't stop them as musicians and artists from evolving throughout their entire lives. You know, there was that point where Darguto, you indicated, realized that he had very, very little time left. And that seemed to be that first instance where, maybe not the first, but where it seemed that Kulusevich, where he then was there, and there was this new sense of urgency. And then he felt that after that death, he realized he had this, I don't know if you want to call it, was it a mission, or was it more, did he feel it was destiny, or did he feel it was a responsibility, or both?
I think responsibility is the right word.
Let me turn things over. Can we just also for a moment put up this beautiful image of Colin, if you're there? Can we put up that image on the screen for everybody? And I know it's also behind me, but this is just an incredible image. And when I saw this, I thought it spoke of everything about his life and journey that you describe in the book. And also, I think that any artist in the room now, in the virtual room, so to speak, tonight, can connect with this, because you had made a comment to me that, to the effect, I'm looking at my notes, regarding culture. You said, you wrote, actually in the book, you wrote, culture belonged to the prisoners. Briefly, but importantly, what did you mean by that?
Well, what I meant was that in Nazi camp, almost everything is taken away from the prisoners. Their freedom, their ability to control basic things about their lives, what they eat, how much they eat. The SS took away everything effectively from them. All of their kind of basic rights and privileges as people, as humans, were taken from them. The one thing I think that wasn't taken from them, that couldn't be taken from them, was culture, was music. The SS did not have the ability to steal that part from them, and that's so obvious when you look at the accounts of people who survived the camps, who almost always talk about culture being this incredibly important part of their survival often. We have accounts of people getting up in front of their barracks mates to recite a poem they knew, just to recite a part of a book that they knew by heart, or to sing music, or to share something. Those moments, according to testimony, were crucial, and they were one of the few things that they maintained despite their incarceration, despite the horrible circumstances that they found themselves in.
Thank you. We can go to questions. And Makana, I don't know if you can see those, Colin. How will that work?
Are they in the chat maybe, or I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think so. Q&A. Can you see that?
I don't think there's a question so far.
Yeah, I don't think there's a question so far. While we're waiting for a question, what effect did this have on you? I know that would take a lot of time, but you did indicate to me a couple of weeks back in chatting that it was overpowering at one point.
Yeah, I think I naively went into this project thinking that I would be able to stay above it. That these are stories that happen to other people and don't really affect, in a kind of serious sense, people reading about them or writing about them. I think that wasn't entirely true. There were certainly moments about a year into it, after being immersed in the music, but also just in these testimonies of life in a Nazi camp, that were heavy, that were kind of show up in your dreams, or live with you in a way that you didn't expect. I think above all, the lyrics themselves, the music itself, is what affected me the most. Music has a way of cutting into your emotion with more efficiency than other forms of art, in my opinion, at least. And to hear Kulishevich sing the Jewish death song, or to sing Aaron Liebeskin's song, it can bring you to tears, in my opinion, and it's really a difficult experience, especially over a long period of time. So I definitely kind of felt the heaviness of this topic much more than I may have anticipated.
You reminded me of, I think it was Frederick B. Weissman in Los Angeles said some years ago. He said, art is, in this case music, art is quicker than language and clearer than philosophy. And I think that really comes out in this. And I want to say something else spontaneously. In the past, reading Viktor Frankl, who was in the camps, and he wrote these early seminal works about, post-war, about his experiences. And he focused very heavily upon the idea that something similar you touched on here is that this idea that what can you not take away from a person? You can even take their life, but even as you do it, you still can't take away their culture. You can't take away the language, and you can't take away the artistry or whatever else is their individual passion, right? And I wanted to say that the Frankel books are riveting, but yours to me, and he was there, but you writing about this is equally riveting. Somehow there's a completely, for me as a reader, and for those here who are interested in reading the book, I was really struck immediately and then throughout the entire course of the work by there's no air, there's no space between yourself and the subject matter that you're looking at. I did sense that in addition to being an author from a book sense of the word, you're a journalist, and I think that there's a balance and an objectivity that you maintain. But as you just indicated, that was a bumpy road emotionally, and the exhaustion that I think you described to me before that you felt upon the completion of the work. Is it too early to talk about what's next? I know that you're working on things, and if it's too early, that's fine. But we'll all be watching, especially anybody who's read this or will read it. Will really anticipate whatever you focus on next.
Well, at the moment, I'm expecting a child in a few weeks, so
Right.
that's the thing that's mostly on my mind. I have a couple ideas. I have a long thought that turning my attention somehow to my home state of Hawaii and writing about the history of this place and the current situation is of interest, but how and in what way I don't yet know. For the moment, I'm focusing more on short things, on articles and features in Europe, and above all, preparing myself for sleepless nights and for the upcoming parenthood.
Okay, yeah, you're going to be busier than ever. I promise you that. I myself will say that these days at this point in my life, I always had a general rule that I'll try and balance somewhat 50-50, figuratively speaking, in my ongoing reading personally, between nonfiction and then classics with this book, it's something that I might not have normally picked up, and I look for those lessons that are much more immemorial now. Again, the philosophers, the Greeks, the Romans, and everybody in between, right up to anywhere Foucault or Baudrillard or anybody you want to talk about. But I have to say that this really changed my thinking. I think that with the amount of book publishing going on today with contemporary events, where a big book comes out and then 2 weeks later, a political event takes place and it's no longer relevant because the author was actually wrong, and this really reinstilled my belief in the great significance of someone who focuses on something very deeply and digs very, very deep. And I think you brought out, Kusevich, he definitely memorialized priceless things, and there's an inventory there, as you said, 70,000 sheets of paper and more. But I think that you took his work to a 2.0 in the sense that if he ever knew how much deeper someone had dug, including into his story that he must have assumed was lost forever, that's really, really an extraordinary accomplishment on your part. So I really congratulate you for that. And if you haven't read it, as one of our favorites, Gore Vidal, once said, read it. Here it is. Right, where's that book? You can't see it on this on the screen, but you know where to find it. So I thank you for that. And we're in the next couple of minutes, we'll go back to Roger Jelinek, who wants to talk about some other things coming up with the Book and Music Festival, which is really extraordinary. I was 3 years ago, just before COVID, I was in Oxford, and there was the book festival in Oxford, and you'd expect the pedigree to be excellent, and it really, really was. but I like ours more. Because there's this diversity. And one of the things Roger and I have talked about is the fact that this is allowing us to reach around the world with people. It's not only here in situ physically, but that we can do something like this. You're in Paris and we're in Honolulu or anywhere else around the world. And we can reach out and we can all really, really connect. And finally, I'll leave it alone simply to say that the relevance of this book in so many ways in terms of not only answering questions, but posing new ones about the things going on in the world today is a really, really valuable optional, but really, really valuable tool, in my opinion. Makana, any other thoughts you'd like to add or you'd like us to know or understand? Roger's coming on and you've got about 30 seconds.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, for all your kind words and for doing this discussion. It was really a pleasure to be here, and thank you everyone for in the audience for being here too. It's a thrill to be part of this and to share this book that I worked on for a long time, and I'm happy to be finished with, but I'm proud of it as well.
Thank you, Makana.
Well, thank you
Roger.
both. It was a really fascinating discussion, and I'm just very privileged to be your host. This has been recorded, and the video will be eventually available indefinitely in our website and in our YouTube channel, slightly edited, so it will not be lost. And I just want to take a moment to say that I very much hope that you will see, to the attendees, that you will see that this is an example of what we do and what we're trying to do on a larger scale when we can actually fund a full-on festival where we have often as many as 12 simultaneous venues and 150, 175 separate events. You then have the fun of serendipity. You see a lot of people looking at something, or maybe Peter Shaindlin reciting his poetry, and you wonder why there's so many people there. And you go over there, you had no intention of going there, and then suddenly you're absolutely enveloped. So this is what we're trying to do. And if you've enjoyed this, do have a look at some of the other events that we're doing. We have a fundraiser next Thursday. We'd love to have you take part, or if you can't take part, to donate via our website. It's really important because we just have to get back to do the real thing. But in the meantime, this was pretty much the real thing. So thank you very much, Makana, and thank you very much, Peter. It was extraordinary.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.